In this video, we're going to be talking about the transition away from topics which are common to both microeconomics as well as macroeconomics to focus on those which are unique to macroeconomics. And so to kick this off here, we're going to introduce one of the really most basic ways of viewing macro phenomena, and that is national income accounting, which in our country is produced and generated by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and I've given you their website. And if you're looking on that website for any specifics, feel free to get with me and I can direct you to all kinds of different databases and current data, historical data, to show you what GDP, that is the total output of goods and services, has been over time. So when we talk about GDP, which we also refer to sort of algebraically as the capital Y symbol, we're talking about the total output of goods and services produced in an economy in a given year. And in a couple of videos in the future, we'll talk a bit more about how we adjust GDP for price level changes. So the thing that we want to get into today is to talk about national income accounting, particularly the two approaches to computing them. The first that we're going to talk about in this video is the expenditures approach, which is something that you'll see quite a lot discussed in your textbook. And what it really is the demand side of the macroeconomy. That's really what's going on here. It's who is doing the buying of the output. GDP refers to the output of the economy. And by the way, the term GDP and the algebraic symbol Y, and the term output and the term income are all used interchangeably because they're all one and the same thing. They're all the same dollar figure. It's just that we're trying to find two different ways to get there. In the first case, we're saying who's doing the buying of the goods. And then the second approach, which we'll cover in the next video, is the income approach, and that is who's doing the receiving of the income in exchange for supplying output, including, by the way, government-produced output. So we'll get to that here in the next video. But let's talk about the expenditures approach and talk about how we arrive at the GDP number, which is computed annually by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, so GDP or Y. It's composed of four distinct elements of expenditure: consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. And I'll define what all of these are very concretely. When we talk about these various elements of spending, it's important to go back to the circular flow model and talk about who's doing the buying here. And in this case, when we talk about consumer spending, we're talking about the demand generated by households. When we're talking about investment spending, and your text elaborates on this a bit more explicitly, we're not talking about investment like someone buying stocks or investing in a mutual fund. Instead, we're talking about business firms doing the investing in things like plant and equipment, and we'll talk more concretely about that in a minute. So households, firms, and then the final bit here is government. Government, as we know, demands goods, and we'll talk about what some of the examples of those are. Then we have a final number here, which seeks to open this to the rest of the world, because if this were the only thing we'd be talking about, these three elements of demand, we'd say this is a closed economy. In other words, a closed economy is one economy in which nothing comes in, nothing leaves, no one comes in, no one leaves, money doesn't flow in, money doesn't flow out. So that would be a closed economy. But if we open this up, we have what is known as an open economy. An open economy includes all of these elements, and we'll talk about what this refers to when we talk about an open economy and who is doing the demanding. So just relating this back to the circular flow of households, firms, and governments. And I probably should elaborate on this and call that governments, because we'll talk about federal as well as state and local. Okay? Well, let's get into it. Let's talk about what some of the elements of spending are here. And in so doing, we can also talk about the contribution to overall GDP from these various elements. And as we progress from this very introductory video today, we'll be able to see how changes in these affect changes overall GDP, and then, moreover, what to do about it. And that's really taking us to macro policy, which is a bit later in the course, but we'll get there. But for right now, we want to focus on what exactly is being discussed when we talk about these four elements. And so the first of these is consumer spending. And in the national income accounts, this is now referred to very explicitly as personal consumption expenditures. And so if you're looking online on the BEA website or other websites which contain this information, census data and whatnot, personal consumption expenditures is noted, and that's the same as C, our simple algebraic shorthand for consumption. So what about personal consumption expenditures, and what exactly are we talking about here? We're talking about really three categories of outputs, or demand for goods. And the first of these is what we would call durable goods, and the second are non-durable goods, and I'll give you a definition of all of these in a second. And then the third category are services. So durable goods, non-durable goods, and services. So the first of these is durable goods, and what exactly are durable goods? These are goods which have an expected useful life of greater than 3 years, And so when we talk about durable goods, we're talking about goods which are, as the term implies, durable, that is, they've got a sort of a lifespan. And we're talking about things like automobiles, furniture, computers, television sets, washing machines, dryers. We wouldn't be talking about things like cranes and forklifts, however, because that's really not a consumer item. Households wouldn't buy that item. If they did, they wouldn't be a household, they'd be using it for some other purpose. So that's what durable goods are. And one thing that we should mention with regard to durable goods, and there's another particular distinguishing factor here, is that these tend to be, and everyone's definition of this may obviously differ, but these tend to be big ticket items. So things like cars and trucks, appliances, furniture, those are big ticket items, and they're often financed by borrowing. So that's one of the key things to know about this, is they're often financed by borrowing. Okay, so those are durable goods. Okay, what are non-durable goods? Durable goods are all of the goods that have a physical characteristic of being a good, as opposed to being a service. And we distinguish goods from services in the sense that goods have a physical substance. We can move them around, we can put them on a truck, they can burn up in a fire and whatnot. And there tends to be something of a lag time between production and consumption. Not so with services, which can't be shifted around typically, can't really be inventory, can't burn up in a fire. And so all other goods, in this case, the non-durable goods are those aspects which are, as the term implies, non-durable. In other words, less than 3 years. And so what are we really talking about here? We're talking about everything else. So less than 3 years' time, which, if we wanted some examples, two of the big categories here are things like food and clothing, but not limited to this. It could be things like household items like soap and shampoo and whatnot. All of those are non-durable goods. And the final category is services. And these are goods which, again, are non-inventoriable. They're not able to be shipped. They tend to be produced and consumed at the same time, although there are some exceptions to this. And of these, the thing that we should note is that a big one here, and even though there are some goods, physical goods that go into this, but healthcare, we'll just simply lump under services. In reality, there are healthcare goods like wheelchairs and stretchers would go somewhere else. But nonetheless, we'll talk about healthcare consumption altogether. And we've heard a lot about healthcare in the last several years, notably with the Affordable Care Act and efforts to try to rein this in, because this one area, healthcare, under services, has been growing dramatically to the point where it's reaching something around 1/6 of GDP, which is a big percentage. Not 1/6 of consumption, not 1/6 of services, but 1/6 of GDP. So it's a big number. And obviously that number includes more than simply just the services, but it would include things like financial services, like insurance. It would also include personal services like attorney's fees, accounting fees, etc. Okay, so that does it for the consumption side. What should we know about consumer spending altogether? One important aspect of this is historically it's been about 2/3 of GDP. And in the last several years it's actually been a bit higher. It's been somewhere closer to around 0.71 GDP, 0.7 of GDP. It's a big number. I say this is an historical value, and I really bring it up here to sort of point out the importance of the consumer, because I think there's a tendency for people to think, well, the economy is dominated by big business and by government. And in reality, at least from the demand side of things, the consumer has lots of power, at least around 7/10 of the buying power throughout the economy. So I think it's important to sort of keep that in mind. Okay? So that does it for consumption. I'm going to erase this just to sort of make some room here for what I'm going to do next. I'm going to talk about investment. And I will leave some of this up here in order to wrap this up here in just a second. So what about investment? If it's not buying stocks and buying bonds and investing in mutual funds, then what is it? In the national income accounts, this is referred to very explicitly as gross private domestic investment. This is spending by businesses on what we would call capital goods. earlier on in the text there was a discussion of the factors of production, that is input factors, resources used in making things. Well, what do businesses do? They make things and they employ things and they purchase things in order to do them. And so when we talk about the purchasing things, we're talking about really three categories here as well. The first of these is what we would call fixed investment. And if you were to look over some of the historical charts of GDP, you might see this called BFI, or business fixed investment. Today, fixed investment is really what is sufficient here. The second of these is new construction. And one of the things that is worth noting here is that in the earlier discussion of consumption, in particular durable goods, one of the things that I did not say was a durable good was new homes. New homes actually goes under new construction for reasons that I'll get to here in just a second. So even existing homes would not go under that because you're not actually purchasing anything newly constructed that creates new income. That does not necessarily count. And then the final one here is the change in inventories. Again, using the delta symbol to represent change, the change in inventories. So let's talk about what is going on here with regard to these three categories of investment. So fixed investment, what we're really talking about here are things like property, plant, and equipment. And so we're talking about things like the forklifts, and the cranes, and the conveyor belts, the example I used earlier of goods, which are used in the production process. So businesses purchase goods, in this case fixed goods that don't go anywhere. They're sort of analogous to durable goods, but not for consumers, but for businesses. And by the way, they are also often they're considered big ticket items, and oftentimes are financed by borrowing. And the borrowing aspect of this will become a bit clearer as we progress, because we'll be talking very emphatically about the relationship between all of I and the interest rate. The interest rate is a critical component of this, and as rates change, we would expect to see changes here, and then changes to translate on the other side of this equation. So more on that a bit later. Property, plant, and equipment, things like machinery and equipment that are used in the production of other kinds of goods. And also just to sort of give you a real brief, in the interest of time, wrap up here, things of technology, of a technological nature. Not a laptop computer you would use at home, but rather technology used in the production of other goods. And the story of the Industrial Revolution really is grounded in the story of technology. Without the technology of production, it would be impossible to have the high-tech goods that we consume today. So technology is rooted in this, and we could be talking about computing technology, telecommunications technology, quality control technology. It goes on and on. It's a big subject, but it's one that would fit into this category economically. When we talk about new construction, we're talking about various kinds of new construction. Certainly residential fits into this. And oftentimes students will say, well, why does residential construction go under I, go under business spending? Why does it go under C? And so let's talk about why that's the case. The reason it's not the case is because who builds homes? And we're talking about the initial purchase, initial construction of a home, some new construction, who hires the workers, who buys the materials. It's a business usually. And by the way, people have said, well, what if I build my own home? Well, that would really make you a contractor in this case, and you would take over, in essence, the same function. And by the way, you could say the same about what if you made your own soap at home? What if you made your own whatever at home? That would be similar to you being a producer throughout the economy. Whether or not we'd be able to capture that in the GDP accounts is another problematic nature of GDP as a whole. That is, people doing things that are not really accounted for, but that's a discussion for a later time. So residential construction, also things like commercial and industrial, these are a little bit different from one another. Commercial space, we tend to think of being office and retail, and industrial, which by the way, as to commercial, can have alternative uses. A fast food restaurant could, 2 years later, be converted to an accounting office, then converted back to something else later. Industrial property tends to be more or less single use. Steel plant's always going to be a steel plant. There's really no conversion ability. But those are all part of this as well. And by the way, these are also, as you might imagine, big ticket and subject to changes in interest rates. And then the final one here is changes in inventories. Changes in inventories. We're going to have much more on this when we talk about one of the first models of macroeconomics. We'll talk about the importance of inventory swings, because if we talk about the ups and downs of GDP, which we're going to do very shortly. And we look for causes, and we look for where we can sort of attribute those changes in GDP, which we all know happen. We all know the economy goes up and it goes down. Oftentimes we zero in on this guy here, investment, because of the rather instability of some of this, and in particular this one here, and particularly in years past when inventories were a much more important part of the economy. So changes in inventories, and more on that a bit later, okay? Unlike personal consumption expenditures, I can't give you a percentage of GDP that is sort of a rule of thumb. Excuse me, and the reason I can't is because this is somewhat unstable. It has a lot to do with changes in interest rates, expectations of sellers, etc. So it becomes much more difficult to do that. The third category, government spending. Well, this is one that's relatively straightforward. In fact, when we talk about government spending or government expenditure, what we're really talking about is two categories. And in this country, we have a division between federal and state. So we have federal, and we have state spending. And again, this is spending or demand for output throughout the economy. So let's take the federal government. Now, if you look into the national income accounts under the expenditures approach, and if anyone wants any direction on how to access some of these, let me know, because it's somewhat involved, but once you figure out how to get there, it's relatively straightforward. We have really two categories, and the first of these is defense spending, where I'll just go ahead and label as national defense. And so there's national defense, and then there's everything else. And as you might be aware, the U.S., when we are talking here about the U.S. economy, although this model is useful in analyzing other economies, but one thing that's noteworthy about ours, almost uniquely, is the very large contribution of national defense to total federal spending and hence to total government spending. It's a big number, and in the last several years, particularly after 9/11, that number has gone up dramatically, and I mean very dramatically. Non-defense is everything else, and that's the public administration, it's all the alphabet soup of agencies, it's the judicial system at the federal level, it's law enforcement, border patrol, all those kinds of things which go into federal spending. Okay? We'll talk much more about government spending, particularly in relation to how it's funded, a bit later. And then finally, state spending. And when we talk about state spending, we're also talking about state and local. And in this case, local government in the U.S. is a subset of state government. So it's really a function of state government. And when we talk about some examples of this, we're talking about things like public education as one example. States tend to fund public education. Also, even though I mentioned law enforcement under federal, the bulk of law enforcement is actually done at the state level, state and local. So law enforcement goes into this. And also things like public infrastructure, which the term infrastructure may be familiar to you, simply refers to things like roads and bridges, highways, sidewalks. In some cases, it can include power lines, water lines, etc. Here, it's also not possible, unlike consumer spending, to sort of hang an earmark as to a common percentage of GDP, because it does fluctuate, albeit not as much as government spending, as much as investment does. So what's the final category here? The final category is this last one, which is the only value, the only term on the right side of this equation has a plus or minus, because it could in fact be negative, and that is the case of the net exports. Net exports, which are simply the value of exports, goods sold to foreign buyers, minus the value of imports, which are the goods purchased from foreign sellers. So most of us know the difference between exports and imports, but what may be less clear is the difference between these two. Exports, goods sold to foreign buyers, imports, goods purchased from foreign sellers. And what we are really trying to get at is what is the contribution plus or minus to GDP. And so in cases in which exports are greater than imports, is a situation when economists use the word trade, we're almost always talking about international trade. We're talking about a trade surplus, which means we have a positive net export value, which then translates into an increase in GDP to the upside. So positive net exports leads to an increase in GDP to the upside. So positive increase. It may not mean that GDP overall is rising, but at least it'll cause the change in this contribution to be upwards. If exports, however, are less than imports, then we have a condition called a trade deficit. And by the way, this is not the first of the surpluses and deficits we'll be talking about. So in other words, if America buys more from foreign sellers than what it sells to foreign buyers, we have a trade deficit which has a negative effect on net exports, which means the contribution to GDP now is downward. And at present, where is the U.S. economy? And the U.S. economy has a negative value here. We've had a trade deficit for most every year since the early 1960s. It's been a long-running issue, and it's something that it's actually grown larger in the last few years. Occasionally shrinks and grows and expands, but it nonetheless is negative, meaning that every year that goes by, and every time we buy an imported good, we actually contribute to a sort of slowdown in gross domestic income. That is the gross domestic product, or the income earned by Americans. Okay? One final bit here, and then I'll move on to the next video, is this. Since I said that we can sort of say, okay, around 70% of GDP is composed of consumption. That's pretty stable. Then what can we say about consumption in general? In that it is very stable. This is actually good news. And one reason why it's good news is because the majority of the U.S. economy, at least on the demand side, is stable, which contributes to a relatively stable GDP. It doesn't always seem that way, but it is very stable. And that is actually good news. The consumer, and if you think about it, the consumers don't change their behavior all that radically. We pretty much know what our incomes are. We know what our spending is going to be. We rarely step out of that. And even if we do, it's predictable. What about I and everything under I? I is considered to be very unstable. And unstable means volatile. And as a result, I sort of alluded to this a bit earlier. Because of the volatility, sometimes it's difficult for us to know what's happening with investment, but we will focus again later on why that's important. Government spending is mostly stable. It does change. It's gone up over time, but and I know that there are people who would have you believe that government spending is this monstrous force behind all spending. It's actually not as high as it was, or not even close to as high as it was during World War II, for instance, when the government share of the economy was about half. But it is relatively stable nonetheless. And net exports are mostly stable, but it's the smallest portion. And so as a result of this, we can say it's mostly stable. Even though it's a negative and it's a drag, it's mostly stable. And so the good news about this is we're going to see that GDP, even though it seems like a wildly unstable variable, is in fact fairly stable. And where it does change, we'll talk a lot of times the contribution of that instability or volatility comes from overall investment, in particular some of the components like construction, like inventories. And so I hope this was helpful, at least getting a first look at the elements of demand. And if anyone has any additional questions or would like resources to the national income accounts, please contact me.